Swap over for the backbench business debate. We now come to the backbench debate on knife crime against children and young people. Before we begin the debate, can I remind honourable members of the House's rule on matters sub judice. Members should make no reference to live criminal cases in which a suspect has been charged. So we're coming on to the knife crime debate, and I call Ben Obese-Jecty to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered knife crime amongst children and young people. I would firstly like to place on record my gratitude to the Backbench Business Committee in granting this time in the House of Commons chamber, and I would also like to thank all those from both sides of the House who supported my application for a debate on this topic. There are some issues that I believe rise above the Punch and Judy vaudeville that characterises so much of our political debate. I called for this debate because I believe it is a topic that Parliament needs to discuss bravely, honestly, frankly and robustly. I believe it transcends party politics and party lines. It is a debate that I've been calling for several years, since long before I became a Member of Parliament myself. I wholeheartedly welcome this government's pledge to halve instances of knife crime over the next decade. The previous government sought to tackle knife crime and was sadly unable to do so effectively. And though I don't doubt either government's intent and desire to achieve that aim, I am sceptical that this government will fare much better than the last. For all the hype and the fanfare, this is an issue that repeatedly falls by the wayside until it is thrust back into the spotlight with the tragic death of yet another child. Put simply, I don't believe governments of any hue have shown the mettle required to tackle this with the resources, approach and focus that is required. There are no easy solutions to this issue. The government's most recent data shows that of 19,903 offences resulting in a caution or conviction for possession of a knife or offensive weapon, juveniles aged 10 to 17 years old were the offenders in 18% of cases. A community sentence was the most common sentence given to those 10 to 17-year-olds, 61% of all knife and offensive weapons offences across that age demographic. Over the past decade, 10 to 17-year-old offenders showed the biggest decrease in average sentence length, with a 25% decrease from 8.1 months in March 2014 to 6.1 months in March 2024. Around 70% of youth offenders were committing their first offence. 57 young people aged under 25 were murdered with a knife or sharp object in the 12 months to March 2024. 17 of those 57 were children aged under 16. In 2023, the most recent year for which the data is available, just 6.5% of knife and offensive weapon offences resulted in immediate custody. With a 93% chance of not going to prison, why should anyone carrying a knife fear the law? Prior to becoming the MP for Huntingdon, I spent a decade working in London and lived in Haringey in North London. At that time, Haringey had the second highest rate of knife crime in London. It is difficult to explain what it is like to live in an area of London where murders and stabbings become so commonplace as to elicit little more than a shrug from local residents, where police tape closing your road or your local park is normalised to the point of merely being an inconvenience, where the murder of a child doesn't make the national news, where 5 children being charged with murder doesn't make the national news, as was the case with the murder of taxi driver Gabriel Bringier in 2021. This desensitisation is but one part of the problem. Over a 3-year period, there were at least a dozen fatal stabbings within a mile of my front door. Several of those victims were children, half of those arrested in connection as the perpetrators were too. I remember the murder of Stelios Averkiou, 16 years old, stabbed multiple times by his assailant after he resisted his mobile phone being stolen in the Lordship Recreation Ground. I was in the park shortly afterwards and saw the aftermath. I remember for weeks afterwards the handwritten posters on the trees around the park asking for anyone to come forward with information. I remember the murder of 17-year-old Anas Mezena, fatally stabbed near Turnpike Lane Station in another fight over a mobile phone. The 17-year-old boy guilty of the stabbing had dozens of videos on his own phone posing with large blades. Whilst on remand in a recorded phone call, he'd stated, "Just wanted my little chinging, you get it? My first little juice on my blade. It's just gone in my man's arse. The whole 15 went in down his arse." Anas died from a fatal stab wound to the buttocks from a knife with a 15cm blade. All 5 charged with the murder were children. I remember the murder of 17-year-old Ali Baygoran, stabbed in the neck twice outside his home just across the road from the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. His murderer, a 16-year-old boy, was on bail, having only 9 months before stabbed a 14-year-old boy in a dispute over a lighter, leaving a knife buried in his chest. That boy survived. There are dozens more. On Tuesday, a 17-year-old boy was stabbed after a mass brawl involving young men armed with machetes erupted in Forest Gate, East London. On Monday afternoon, a 15-year-old boy was stabbed in broad daylight in Turnberry Park in Birmingham. On Saturday, a 15-year-old was stabbed in Macdonald's in Southall, with two 14-year-olds arrested. Last Friday in Oxford, a 16-year-old boy was stabbed, two 13-year-olds and a 12-year-old were arrested. Last Thursday, a 15-year-old boy was stabbed at the Bobby Moore Academy in Stratford. 3 boys were arrested. Last week in Yorkshire, a 15-year-old boy was found guilty of the attempted murder of a 14-year-old girl with a samurai sword on a camping trip last November. She suffered 10 wounds, including damage to her lung and her liver. The forensic pathologist report said she was lucky not to have been killed. The court heard claims he'd been offered £20 by a friend to attack her. These are not isolated incidents. These are a daily occurrence across the country. These are vicious, feral, deranged attacks, traumatic for the victims and for those involved, and yet they are often little more than a passing headline and list of other, more newsworthy tragedies. We're all aware of the role that social media plays in this context and how their algorithms can facilitate a dangerous influence on young users. For children and young people, their world is small, often limited to their school, their friends and people they know in their neighbourhood. But with access to social media, that changes. Their world remains small, but the issues within it amplified, blown out of all proportion. In their 2021 paper, Knife Crime in the Capital, Policy Exchange wrote, "The frequency with which young people associated with gangs are confronted with violent videos on social media shifts their perception of normality, desensitising them and increasing the chance that they will react violently. It also reinforces the perceived need to carry weapons for protection." In the intervening period since that paper was written, that same influential factor has rippled outwards to children not associated with any gangs, who exist in a very online world where it is all too easy to become seduced by the belief that carrying a knife is a normal and essential aspect of everyday life, that the threat of attack is ever present, and that carrying a knife is a key component of self-defence. Police forces have even now altered their approach to sharing images of weapons seized during operations after feedback that this in itself contributes to the process of desensitisation and simultaneously makes young people feel that their local area is unsafe, thus encouraging them to carry a knife themselves. But you need look no further than the social media platforms that we ourselves use: Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. I use YouTube every day, but scratch the surface and you can find harmful content such as scoreboard videos outlining who has stabbed or killed whom in localised turf wars for gang supremacy. These scoreboard videos brazenly chase clout, highlighting those involved, outlining who wetted someone, who burst someone else, who bust their case, i.e. got away with it in court, and who therefore remains dangerous and at large, and illustrates that those involved can often enjoy a degree of impunity. I'll give way.
Thank the Honourable Member for making such an impassioned speech on this. He's just outlined some of the roles of the social media companies. Does he agree that the same rigour that we use rightly to catch some of the perpetrators committing some of these crimes should be applied to the social media giants who refuse, in some cases, to take down really explicit and graphic images on their website saying it doesn't breach their content?
I would absolutely agree with the Honourable Member, and that is a very valid point. I think that the social media companies themselves, they know full well that this content is there, and their ability to moderate it could easily be created. These are billion-dollar companies, and if they wanted to take this stuff down, they could. So it is about willpower, and I think it's part of our responsibility in this House to try and make sure that that happens going forwards. Fear of being stabbed or killed far outweighs any fear of the police. You only need to watch one of these videos to see how an endless immersion into this world can negatively cloud your judgment. When I asked the Justice Minister if such videos would be used as evidence in order to prosecute the government's new law of possession of a knife with violent intent, I didn't receive an answer to that aspect, and I'm not sure if the Minister quite understood what I was making reference to, but I would ask the Policing Minister if she could address that specific point in her summing up at the end of the debate.
Would my honourable friend give way? I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and can I congratulate him on securing this important topic and making a very empowered speech on this. He's talking about the dangers of social media influencing often boys and young men. One of the key aspects as well is their role in society and the lack of clear role models. Would he join me in paying tribute to the former England football manager, Sir Gareth Southgate, who in his Richard Dimbleby lecture this week articulated that, the importance of role models and for boys and young men to get involved in active sport so that they then become normalised in that setting and not be drawn into this dreadfully violent world.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I would absolutely agree with that. And it's something that I mentioned later on in terms of the interventions that have taken place with regards to trying to get people into a more collegiate and embracing atmosphere. But I think the issue of role models is one that's very valid, and sadly my speech is already long and I would have loved to have covered that in more detail as well. But I think that is a huge aspect of the reason we see young men being drawn into this type of violent world. Scoreboard videos are inextricably linked to drill music, and whilst drill music is a genre, it is also the medium by which various groups, come gangs, are able to taunt their ops. The catalyst for multiple stabbings, often fatal. The line between gang and group are blurred to the point of irrelevance. Meanwhile, the media either doesn't know or doesn't care. Inner city black youths are, whether consciously or unconsciously, expendable and interchangeable. Overrepresented in statistics as both victim and perpetrator, the soft bigotry of low expectations makes black culture ripe for exploitation as a cheap way to appear edgy, irrespective of the upstream impact. But media, large corporations, even the BBC, play their part in the creation of this milieu, leaning into it and giving it validation. The cynical valorisation of the most detrimental aspects of urban black culture and the celebration of criminality via musicians is one of the most toxic, overarching influences on how we have pushed this issue into the mainstream. Irving Ajayi, aka Heady One, went to prison 3 times as a teenager, amongst them for dealing crack cocaine and heroin. In June 2019, Ajayi was arrested for possession of a knife following a stop and search. Whilst on bail, Ajayi completed his UK tour, released his album, which reached number 5 in the UK charts, appeared on Stormzy's album Heavy as the Head, played Glastonbury and was featured on BBC Radio 1, was used in an advertising campaign alongside heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua for JD Sports, and also fronted an advertising campaign for Adidas that December. That's the same Adidas who ran their No More Red knife crime awareness campaign alongside Arsenal FC just a couple of miles down the road shortly after that, but are also happy to run an advertising campaign with a rapper on bail for possession of a knife. The hypocrisy of brands like Adidas is off the scale. Less than a month after launching this Adidas promo, Ajayi was sentenced to 6 months for possession of that knife and went to prison for a 4th time. He was released that April. 6 months later, his single is number 2 in the charts, and he's having praise lavished upon him by the Times newspaper, and he's never looked back. How does this convince anybody that there is any penalty whatsoever for carrying a knife? If anything, it's been an asset for someone like him, the edginess I referred to earlier. In September 2019, The Guardian published a piece about UK drill rappers OFB, who hail from the same Broadwater farm estate in Tottenham as Irving Ajayi, stating that the drill trio OFB are trying to move the genre beyond the violence for which it has been demonised. The interview is with 2 of the 3 in the group, Banda K, aka Kamani Duggan, the son of Mark Duggan, and Double L's, casually mentioning that the third, 17-year-old SJ, is not around today. Several months later, it subsequently transpired that SJ, aka Jaden O'Neill Critchlow, was not around today because he was on remand for his part in the murder of Kamali Gabon Link 7 months previously. O'Neill Critchlow was one of 5 young men, 4 of whom were teenagers, who received lengthy sentences of 20 years plus after they arrived on Wood Green High Street on a Friday night armed with machetes, a handgun and a shotgun. Shot at Gabon Link, missing and hitting a packed Nando's restaurant, and chased him down the street, eventually cornering him in a hair salon where he was shot and brutally hacked to death. For his part in the murder, O'Neill Critchlow was sentenced to 21 years. I remember this because it happened 300 metres from my home. I challenged the author of the piece as to why it was appropriate to write a puff piece about a group that had 1 member on remand for murder. He cited that it was an editorial decision by The Guardian. Last year, Kamani Duggan was sentenced to 5 years in prison for possession of a Tokarev pistol and a .22 calibre ammunition with intent to cause fear of violence, the violence which has been demonised. This is precisely the type of irresponsible media valorisation that illustrates my point. Yes,
I'm very grateful, and I congratulate him on bringing to this House this horrific catalogue of embarrassing incidents. I say embarrassing to members of this House and previous administrations because we have been asleep on the job. And would he agree with me that if the legal authorities were able to stamp down on the riots in Southport so effectively last summer by taking tough measures, that is exactly what is called for now? And talk about reducing the incidence of this by half over 10 years is totally inadequate. What needs to be done is immediate action to make an example of this type of crime and deter others from participating.
I would agree with my honourable friend, and I think one of the issues that we have is that the law just simply doesn't act as a deterrent to many of these people. They are far more scared of their immediate surroundings and the danger posed to them in everyday life than they are of being arrested by a police officer, knowing full well that they are unlikely to go to prison unless they have done something as heinous as some of the acts that I've already described. Kieran Thapper, the author of the piece I just described, recently appeared before the Youth Select Committee last December in his new role as Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Youth Endowment Fund. There he explained how drill was an outlet for those involved to express the trauma they've experienced in their lives. Adverse childhood experience is a key part of fueling the likelihood of vulnerable individuals becoming involved. There is a broader question here about immigration, and immigration from countries where experiences of trauma, brutality, war are all contributing factors in youth behaviours within multicultural inner-city communities. The Youth Endowment Fund does important work on knife crime, and their toolkit is often cited as a key resource in providing the tools required to reach children. Last week I spoke to Sharon Ward, Serious Violence Duty Coordinator in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, covering my constituency of Huntingdon. The Serious Violence Duty was introduced by the previous government in January 2023 and requires local agencies to share data and information to help identify the root causes of serious violence occurring locally. Speaking to Sharon about this in depth, she explained that they use a multi-agency public health approach, addressing the underlying risk factors and increase the likelihood that an individual will become a victim or a perpetrator of violence in the first place. The most vulnerable period for children and young people is from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m, as well as later in the evening from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m, with diversionary activity key to reducing those vulnerabilities. She outlined how the path to becoming involved in violence is a slippery slope, where participation in antisocial behaviour is linked to those who progress to more violent crime. I'm sure that the subject of funding for youth services and cuts under the previous government will be raised, and I have focused more on lesser discussed aspects of this wider issue in this speech. But the part played by youth workers in reaching those children and young people who are vulnerable and at risk of embarking on the wrong path is well documented. Cambridgeshire and Peterborough currently has 41 interventions funded by Serious Violence Duty. These range from sport-based to mentoring to relationship building, but all are designed to help those assessed to be vulnerable. We must also be mindful that it's not simply children from certain backgrounds. There are children from all backgrounds who are vulnerable to exploitation by gangs.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Children who don't realise they're being exploited because of the way they're being groomed, given those new trainers or a PlayStation game or a bike by an older person they look up to or are fearful of, seemingly with no strings attached. Then they're on the hook, owing them at best a favour or at worst a debt.
I thank my honourable friend and I congratulate him as well on bringing such an important debate. And just on the point about children, he's made this point a number of times. Does he agree with me that educating our children, our girls and our boys, about the importance of respecting themselves and each other is a very important part of tackling not just knife crime, but all crime? And just on that point as well, I think it is a matter for all governments to do much more in terms of prevention and early intervention. Does he agree with those 2 points?
Thank you, and I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend. The issue that of the general atmosphere in which children are currently finding themselves seems to be one where there is a constant need for validation and to make themselves into something that they twist themselves into something that they're not. And my honest belief is that social media has played a huge part in that. I think it's something that comes across as both being a facile and easy answer to give, but is one that, when you delve into it, is far more complex and far more damaging than I think we're prepared to give credit to. It can be any child that falls into criminality in this way, and speaking to Sharon, she explained how parents need to be part of those discussions, alert to the warning signs. It is vital that schemes like Serious Violence Duty can continue to be funded, though I would ask the government to ensure that such funding is approved well ahead of time, rather than within a few weeks of its end, with the uncertainty that often generates. I welcome the government's decision to ban zombie knives and believe that any steps taken towards reducing the chance of a fatal stabbing are a move in the right direction, but we mustn't smugly pat ourselves on the back and assume that this is all that's required. I was as critical of the previous government's attempt to ban zombie knives as I am of this one, not in the intent, but in the way that it is announced as if it is the solution, rather than a tiny piece of the overall problem. Zombie knives account for just 3.6% of fatal stabbings, the same as a lock knife. Screwdrivers are a more commonly used weapon. By far and away the most common, however, is the kitchen knife. 52.6% of fatal stabbings involve the type of knife we all have in our kitchen, that we've all probably used this morning or last night in our own kitchen. Yes, the zombie knife should be banned, but given its use in a small minority of fatal stabbings, it is not the panacea it is presented as. There have been proposals to change kitchen knives to those with a round rather than pointed tip, as outlined in research by Professor Graham Farrell and Toby Davis, and championed by Idris Elba in his drive to tackle knife crime. I would be interested to hear from the Minister what consideration has been given to this idea, but we cannot pretend that kitchen knives aren't and won't continue to be easily available to anyone with the intention of using one. Drawing this to a close, I'll give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's making an important and passionate speech. And my area of Fife is not an area that has been historically synonymous with knife crime, and we want to keep it that way. Despite that, the possession of weapons in Fife increased by 50% in the last year. And figures like that, along with very concerning recent footage on social media of a young man brandishing a knife shortly before he was attacked, together all of this, to me, acts as a warning sign that we need to act now to prevent worse developments from happening, and I wonder if he agrees with me about that.
I thank the Honourable Member, and I absolutely agree with that. I think we're seeing that the areas that traditionally have not been plagued by this type of violence are increasingly finding it rippling out into those communities. It isn't now just located in large cities and areas that you would traditionally associate with this. Slowly we're finding this moving out into the suburbs. And this is something that we need to nip this in the bud now, if we possibly can, to prevent any more tragedies taking place. I think I wholeheartedly agree. Drawing this to a close, one of the biggest issues with regards to this debate is the key question: why are children now prepared to murder other children? It cannot be ignored that we now see countless examples on a weekly, even daily basis, where a child has been stabbed and the perpetrator is another child. When did children develop a nihilistic worldview whereby their willingness to take the life of another child was made real? In my previous career as an army officer, I instructed new soldiers in Phase 1 training. I know how long it takes to train in the mindset of being prepared to kill to an otherwise civilian teenager. How and why are some children developing this mindset all on their own? Fear is a huge driver for carrying a knife. The Ben Kinsella Trust's Keeping Young People Safe report illustrates how fear is a significant driver of the perception and normalisation of carrying a knife. The report collates the survey results of some 10,000 young people, with 2/3 of respondents harbouring anxiety about knife crime. Shockingly, it shows that even children as young as 10 or 11 years old are considering carrying a knife. Though those numbers are very, very low, it shows that the idea of carrying a knife is within the scope of children who have only just stopped believing in Father Christmas. But are children murdering other children solely out of fear? These children aren't actually under threat. These are fights over little more than perceived slights, and somehow we've reached a stage of such frenzied paranoia amongst children of school age that they believe not only that they need to carry a knife, but that also taking a life is somehow a reasonable, rational response to these situations. There is a sensible argument for access to therapy as a potential solution to address this, though I appreciate that that is easy to suggest and unrealistic to facilitate and implement. I've got on long enough and I want to give other people an opportunity to speak, but I hope to hear many important and interesting contributions from members in the course of this debate, and I open the debate to others to contribute. Thank you.
Yeah. The question is, as on the order paper, I call Paul Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I firstly commend the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for bringing this very important debate to the House. This is a national emergency and it is a huge threat to our society and to our young people. And I do wish to associate myself with many things that you said there. And I totally agree. We've got to stop. I'm not interested in who said what when, politically. What I'm interested in is all of us working together and resolving this issue. We have to deal with it. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to give a voice to victims and families, because I think it's important that we remember behind every stabbing there's a victim, and behind every victim there's a family. There's two in particular I would wish to mention. One of my constituents, Beverly Davis, has been to see me a few times. Beverly's son was stabbed over 120 times on Parbold Hill in Lancashire a few years ago. Alex was his name, he was 18. And the individual that murdered him was also 18. They met online. The platform was used to lure Alex to his death. Beverly feels wholly let down by the justice system now in the support and the communication she has received post this appalling event. The justice system around the country is piecemeal and it must be improved for our victims and families. Secondly, Child A survived the Southport attack. She was stabbed over 30 times. Her and her family live in my constituency. I'm not going to reference her name nor that of her parents, but I asked if they wished to have their voices heard here today in this chamber. And I commend them because they've asked me to read out the following statement. We welcome tougher laws around the purchase of knives and the wider work to reduce knife crime. We are extremely focused from our direct experience on male youth violence against women and girls, but also recognise that knife crime crosses many other areas of our society and tackling this is complex. To reduce knife crime and other acts of violence perpetrated by young men and boys against women and girls, we must look at the motivations, the narratives and the environments they are immersed in. For us, this is the hard work, the work that requires sustained commitment. That commitment comes from us. They go on. The work to reduce knife crime must begin before young people go out to obtain a knife. It is sensible to make it harder to purchase knives, to tighten the law carrying knives. These are tangible solutions that provide a quick reassurance and results. But if a young person is looking for a knife, then we are too late, and they are already on the path to causing harm. We must support parents, caregivers and school leavers better, not only in how they identify and support young people who may be at risk themselves or to others, and how we can all we all can agree that these pathways need overhauls, and the Southport inquiry will serve this purpose. But before that, working with all the children, establishing the fundamentals of healthy relationships, friendships, girls and boys are all equal. Our young people must be exposed to counter messaging from what they may be consuming online or even at home. The work required is vast and complex, but the long-term reduction in knife crime will only be seen if we go back to the start and raise our children better. In the context of violence towards women and girls, current topics are important. Netflix show Adolescence has opened up a conversation about our children's exposure to harmful messaging and themes about women and girls. We are grateful for the coverage happening this week, which is further highlighting the terrifying impact of Andrew Tate and others on vulnerable young boys. I commend that child's parents for having the courage to write that, and the concern that they have, clearly, that this is going to happen again. And I urge all members of this House to please work together for the victims, for the families, and let's please deal with this once and for all. Thank you.
I call Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for securing this important debate and for his thoughtful speech. And I join him in paying tribute to Kieran Thapper, whose work took place in my constituency. And it's a privilege to follow the Honourable Member for Ribble Valley in making a very moving statement on behalf of his constituents. I grew up near Parbold Hill and Southport, and it grieves me very deeply to hear about the appalling violence in both of those communities. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak in this debate on knife crime with great sadness, because today, just after 5 a.m, a young man lost his life on Cold Harbour Lane in my constituency after being stabbed. I visited the scene this morning and stood at the police line as the forensic officers undertook their work. I spoke with community members going about their day and confronted with the shocking aftermath of this violence. And I thought about the family, whose day would begin with a knock on the door from police officers and the utterly devastating news that their loved one wouldn't be coming home ever again. It is hard to feel anything but despair in these circumstances. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that members across the whole House will wish to join me in expressing our sincere condolences to the family and friends of the young man who lost his life. We do not yet know his identity, but we know that there will be people who loved him and who are suffering the most visceral pain and loss today. I also want to pay tribute to the emergency services who attended the scene this morning. When this young man's name is released, it will join the names of others who've lost their lives to serious violence, knife and gun crime in my constituency since I was first elected to this place in 2015. They are Jude Gale, Kyle Parnell, John Ogunjobi, Donnell Rule, Glendon Spence, Dennis Anderson, Beatrice Stoiker, Philippe Oliveira, Chino Johnson, Ronaldo Scott and Keelan Wong, each one loved by their family and friends, each one leaving a community traumatised by their loss and the circumstances of it. When a knife or gun crime is reported in the media, we see the names in the headlines for a few short hours, and maybe again if the case comes to trial. What we never hear about is the ongoing trauma that is left behind in the local community, the sense of loss felt not only by the immediate family, but by everyone who had watched that person grow up, seen them out and about on a daily basis, whose children went to school with their children, who they recognised and who they knew. The sense of fear amongst parents who once again fear that the next time it might be their child who is the victim, and the mental health consequences of living with loss, fear and anxiety. The causes of knife crime are complex, and we need to take a public health approach to it, understanding its pathology and, like a disease, taking steps to prevent it from taking hold, stop its spread and treat both its causes and the symptoms. I introduced a private member's bill in the last Parliament to stop the availability of the most horrific weapons on our streets. I've met with the lead consultants in the emergency department at King's College Hospital who describe the horrific injuries that are inflicted by machetes and zombie knives, weapons which can cut through bone, serrated blades which inflict the most complex injuries on internal organs. They spoke about the impact on survivability of many of these injuries compared with wounds inflicted with domestic knives, and described them as weapons of war on our streets. No one needs a machete or a zombie knife for any legitimate purpose in our communities, yet these weapons have been readily available for purchase online for as little as £10. So I welcome the action that the government has taken since July to further restrict their sale. I would like to see further action on domestic knives, particularly on whether further restrictions on age verification, on the age verification needed to purchase knives with pointed blades, can be introduced. And I would like to see further action up the chain to tackle those who exploit and groom our young people into serious violence. The county lines exploiters, the drug dealers, the serious organised criminals who are not spoken enough in this debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency, in part because of the tragedies we have experienced, we have also seen some inspiring responses from community organisations working together with public services. The embedding of youth workers in hospital emergency departments was pioneered by Red Thread at King's College Hospital in my constituency, providing options for young people who have been injured or seen their friends injured to access support to keep themselves safe, and I welcome that the government is rolling out that intervention in other parts of the country. And I'm grateful to the Mayor of London's Violence Reduction Unit for funding Ecosystem Cold Harbour through the My Ends programme. Ecosystem Cold Harbour is a coalition of grassroots organisations working with young people and families in the Brixton part of my constituency. They've been working for the last 3 years and they have delivered some really impressive results, building the trust and confidence of young people and families to access help and support, providing mentoring and training opportunities, leading the community response when tragedies have occurred, and delivering trauma support to families and communities. Our communities feel empowered by this work, and it is particularly inspirational to see the work of a group of mothers who have all lost a child to serious violence, working together under the banner Circle of Life Ignite, to support each other and to prevent further deaths. I'm also inspired by the way that young leaders have been equipped through this work, and I pay tribute in particular to the work of Abdul Lello, an extraordinarily impressive young man who has been working with Macdonald's in Brixton to embed a youth service in the restaurant, taking support and positive opportunities to young people where they are, with benefits too for the staff who often have felt unsafe and overwhelmed in their workplace. I also want to pay tribute to the work of Sergeant Nigel Pearce from South Central BCU, who has pioneered a different approach to community policing based on trusting and listening to the community and responding respectfully and supportively to their needs and experiences. If we had more officers working in this way across the Metropolitan Police, trust and confidence in policing would be much higher than it currently is. The partnership in my constituency is called Ecosystem because of a belief by the organisations that comprise it, of which it is comprised, that all of the solutions to serious violence are in the community. But the community needs help and resources to find them. That is what we've had through the Violence Reduction Unit, and my plea to the Minister is that the funding for this vital work can be put on a long-term footing so that we can keep on delivering, keep on working to tackle this scourge of serious violence. And I would like to invite my honourable friend the Minister to visit Ecosystem as she thinks about the design of the Government's Young Futures project, because I believe we have much good practice to offer for the development of this national programme. The debate today is about young people and knife crime. But in order to tackle the scourge of knife crime, we must properly understand the nature of the problem and who is affected. Of the victims who've been murdered in my constituency since 2015, only 2 were under the age of 18. The majority were young men in their 20s, a cohort who grew up at a time when funding for youth services was being stripped away, who are often unable to access employment, often due to minor criminal convictions, who often have very poor mental health, are accessing deeply damaging online content, and for whom society can seem like it has very little to offer. There is currently no protocol or good practice for tackling serious violence in this cohort. The only part of the system obliged to try to help is the criminal justice system if the person in question has committed a crime. Social services have no formal role or responsibility. Mental health services are not designed with this cohort in mind, despite the fact that they are so often traumatised by the experiences, by what they've witnessed in their communities, by what they have seen their friends go through. If we want to end the cycle of violence in our communities, we must turn our attention to this group. They are siblings, cousins and parents to the next generation. So the key to prevention must lie in helping them to turn their lives around, making support services more visible in our communities, making it easier to ask for help through services that are designed with their needs in mind, properly resourcing effective rehabilitation. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Government's focus on halving knife crime. My communities have suffered far too much from its devastating effects, and we continue to suffer today. I urge her to work with us to devise services and interventions based on the experience in our communities, because we utterly reject this violence and we just want to see it stop.
Before I call the first speaker, I'm wanting to try and get everybody in, so if people could please stick to around 4 minutes. Belle Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate on knife crime among children and young people. An issue that continues to devastate communities across the country, and I thank the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for securing this debate. Very few people can say they're not deeply concerned about the rising levels of knife crime, particularly children and young people. And as you've heard from my Honourable friend and constituency neighbour, in the early hours of this morning, a young man was stabbed and killed in Brixton, a town centre, which we share, along with the Honourable Member for Vauxhall. And our thoughts go to the young man and his family at this time. It's a tragedy, and even more sadly, it's a tragedy that we hear far too often, because the latest figures show that there were over 50,000 knife-related offences in England and Wales last year. Alarmingly, around 1 in 5 knife possessions involved young people under the age of 18. And in 2023-2024, there were 53 records of homicides using a sharp instrument where the victim was aged 13 years to 19 years. And though these statistics are alarming, we have to remember that these aren't just numbers, they are young lives that are being lost, and with each of them comes a family that will be left grieving and a community that is scarred. Now, I know many members would like to point to the need for more policing, increased stop and search and harsher sentencing, and restrictions on who can buy a knife as solutions. And indeed, successive governments, including this one, have introduced measures along these lines to tackle the surge of knife crime. And I certainly won't stand here and argue that we don't need to review how we are policing this issue. Though when it comes to increased policing measures like stop and search, I do believe that these need to be thoroughly thought through and must be intelligence-led. But increased policing and sentencing is not the only solution, and I would very much argue that it is not a solution that could work on its own. Youth crime and knife crime are a wider societal issue that require a holistic approach. If tougher sentencing and more stop and search powers was all it took, we would have solved this crisis a long time ago. We cannot take reactive steps alone. We have to take preventative ones. I know members opposite don't particularly enjoy it when we point out their record in government, but we can't let this debate go without mentioning the impact of the past 14 years. This is not a political point, just a factual one, because over the 14 years of of the previous Conservative government, we saw the systematic dismantling of the very support systems that help keep young people away from crime. Research from the YMCA showed that youth services had been cut since 73% since 2010, with over 750 youth centres and youth closed and youth workers falling to a third of 1,662 full-time equivalent roles. The result of this has been fewer spaces, fewer mentors and fewer positive role models for young people. A recent Unison report revealed that in England, 1,036 council-run youth centres were closed between 2010 and 2023, and only 480 remained open in April 2023. Funding for Sure Start children's centres, which provided early intervention and family support, has been decimated. Funding for police community support officers, who play a vital role in building trust between police and young people, has been drastically reduced. School budget cuts have squeezed pastoral support, mental health provision and behavioural interventions, increasing exclusions overall. Now, the link between school exclusions and serious violence is well known. Excluded children often fall through the cracks. Many enter pupil referral units where gangs recruit vulnerable young people. Others disengage entirely, making them more susceptible to criminal activity. These cuts have consequences, and when young people lack support, opportunity or hope, they become vulnerable to criminal exploitations. Gangs will step in where the state has stepped back. And it's no coincidence that as these services have disappeared, knife crime has risen. Members opposite cannot ignore the direct correlation between austerity and serious youth violence. But equally, members on this side of the House cannot ignore the direct correlation between austerity and serious youth violence. If we maintain these cuts or extend them even further, that is that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So as a starting point to tackle youth violence and knife crime, I would strongly urge the government to look at reversing these cuts and investing in youth services. I also urge the government to look at how local councils are tackling this issue. I'd like to point to my own council in the Borough of Lambeth. Lambeth Made Safer was launched in 2021 by Councillor Jackie Dyer. It takes a public health approach to violence reduction, focusing on prevention, early intervention and community-led solutions. It prioritises targeted outreach, family support and investment in community initiatives. It is obviously woefully under-resourced, but this is the kind of initiative, community-driven approach that should be rolled out nationwide. There is no simple solution to this crisis, but we can begin to address it by ensuring young people have the wraparound services that we know prevent them from being involved in or the victim of crime. Thank you.
We'll now start with a formal 4-minute time limit. Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the member for Huntingdon? Can I thank my honourable friend from Huntingdon for securing this absolutely important debate? Knife crime continues to cast a dark shadow over our communities, claiming young lives, shattering families and leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Last year in Birmingham, 10 people were stabbed every week, a statistic that is both alarming and unacceptable. Within my constituency, covering Erdington, King's Standing, Castlevale and South Ascot, the B23 postcode has been particularly affected. In 2023, it recorded the highest number of knife-related incidents in the entire city. But behind these statistics are real lives, real families, real pain. When a knife crime tears through families, it destroys lives, it devastates entire communities. Madam Deputy Speaker, just weeks ago, this crisis struck my family, turning our world upside down. My nephew, a kind-hearted, wonderful young man, was brutally attacked in an act of senseless knife violence. His crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. While his wounds are healing, it will take months for him to fully recover. The emotional trauma inflicted on him and in our family, however, is immeasurable. This is a pain no family should ever have to endure, yet it is a pain that far too many are forced to bear. Madam Deputy Speaker, knife crime thrives in the shadows of neglect. 14 years of austerity under the last government gutted our communities, stripping away 70% of the support systems that once guided and protected young people. In Erdington, the closure of the Malcolm Locker Youth Centre in 2014 marked the end of the last council-run youth service in my constituency. These cuts have left a void that too often are filled by despair and violence. I'm glad that this government has recognised the problem of knife crime and included provisions to address knife crime in the Police and Crime Bill. But we can and we must do more. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've always said that prevention is better than cure. And while the police play a vital role in tackling crime, a sustainable solution requires a preventative, community-led and partnership-driven approach. In Birmingham, we have inspiring examples of organisations like Bringing Hope, who I've worked with for many years, who are working relentlessly to tackle knife crime amongst young children and young people. Similarly, the YMCA in Erdington is unwavering in its dedication to our young people. On my recent visit, I celebrated with them the purchase of 83 flats, ensuring young people have safe spaces to live and access to support they need. These initiatives show us the way forward. We must create greater aspirations and opportunities for young people, offering them a future beyond a life of crime. This requires long-term investment in our communities and in our youth services and in the organisations that are already making a difference. Saying that, we can always go even further upstream to supporting families and the deprivation in communities like mine. Madam Deputy Speaker, the young man I mentioned earlier, my nephew, didn't deserve what happened to him. Nobody does. Yet too many families are still left to feel this pain, and too many young people are still becoming victims. We can no longer afford to be complacent. Every moment of inaction puts another young life at risk. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must come together across the House and within our communities to break this cycle of violence. Thank you.
Yeah. I call Harpreet Uppal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for bringing forward this important debate and his moving speech. And can I also mention the member for Birmingham, Erdington? I'm very sorry for what's happened to your family. Knife crime is devastating communities across the country as organised criminal gangs lure children and young people into county line networks and organised criminality. Too many communities have seen children criminally exploited, and sadly we have seen the devastating consequences of knife crime in my constituency. In Huddersfield, Kyrie McLean, 15, and Harley Brown, 17, sadly lost their lives to knife crime in recent years. They were young lives cruelly taken too soon. Too many parents dealing with consequences that no parent should have to face. Communities broken, and too many children and young people left with mental scars. The Home Secretary's announcement of Ronan's Law, along with the launch of the Coalition to Tackle Knife Crime, the Young Futures Prevention Partnerships and Young Future Hubs are all welcome and important steps forward. By introducing stricter regulations on online knife sales and developing an extensive understanding of the root causes of knife crime, we are making it harder for young people to access these weapons in the first place and encouraging different, safer pathways. These measures are welcome, but alone they will not be enough. Other honourable members have raised the matter of social media companies, the use of Spotify by gang members and so-called influencers, and unfortunately algorithms are driving this divisive behaviour. This can't be seen in isolation with what is happening on the ground. Kirklees Council, covering my constituency in Huddersfield, has seen a 70% decrease in funding for their youth services since 2010, and we know that the loss of youth services has been linked to a 14% rise in youth crime within 6 years of closures. We must invest in youth services, community outreach and early intervention. Despite their difficult financial outlook, there are many incredible organisations working within my constituency to support young people, and I do just want to mention a few of them. Positive Steps, Conscious Youth Hub, Central Stars Youth Club, Team Kickstart, Yorkshire Community Development, Empower, Box Power and Temple Wellbeing. The Deputy Mayor of West Yorkshire has also introduced an A&E Navigator and Community Links programme, as other members have mentioned before. This helps to identify and signpost young people into the right support networks at the earliest opportunity. These organisations deliver community services which are outstanding, and they offer young people experiences, opportunities and environments which will allow them to thrive. However, despite their best efforts, the financial constraints they face have resulted in many of them having to reduce the services they offer, and they continue to have to fight for small pots of funding. This is not sustainable longer term. The evidence is clear: when youth services are cut, young people suffer. Can the Minister provide details of when the Young Futures Hubs will be introduced? And I'm keen that Huddersfield and towns like ours are early adopters alongside some of our cities. We must also give communities the tools to tackle this from the ground up. It is usually local people and your local communities who understand the issues the best, but many times they can find themselves fighting against the system rather than being supported by it. No parent should ever have to bury their child, and no community should have to live in fear. I look forward to working with members from across the House and alongside this government to ensure we stamp out this epidemic of senseless violence. Thank you.
Yeah. I call Naushabah Khan.
Thank you, Madam. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for bringing this important debate to the House, as well as commend colleagues for their powerful speeches that we've heard today. It is clear to me that across the House there is undeniable consensus to get this right. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, consensus alone is not enough. There is a national crisis that has devastated families, shattered futures and continues to cause damage. 50,000, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the number of knife-related offences reported by the ONS for the year 2022 to 2023. In just 1 year, 50,000 lives affected, 50,000 incidents of fear, injury and, sadly for some, tragedy. In my constituency of Gillingham and Rainham, we have had several incidences in recent years, including the stabbing of a 17-year-old boy in the town centre by 2 other young people. Members across this House will be familiar with visiting local schools in their constituencies, and many will agree that students are often the toughest crowd, never shy of asking direct and uncompromising questions, with a grilling that some select committees would be put to the test. But time and time again, one issue persists: the issue of safety. They ask me why they should feel afraid to walk through their high street in the evening, why the communities don't feel safe, and why more isn't being done to protect them. Madam Deputy Speaker, it troubles me that most of that is in stark contrast to my own experience growing up in the very same community and in the same area. What I wish to tell them is that that fear and sense of abandonment that they may feel is not inevitable. Some of it is the direct result of years of neglect, and the reality is that the previous government left behind a legacy of cuts and at times indifference to the futures of young people across the country, dismantling the very support systems designed to keep them safe. 1 billion stripped from youth services, 760 youth centres shut down, 4,500 youth workers lost. The evidence is clear. Every pound invested in youth work prevents greater costs down the line. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we view knife crime as the public health crisis that it truly is, then we have to recognise that the principles of upstream prevention have never been more pertinent. Because the truth is, by the time a young person picks up a knife, we've already failed them. That is why this government's coalition on knife crime is a significant step in the right direction, allowing us to get to the root causes of knife crime and not just the symptoms. And I also welcome the Home Secretary's commitment to bringing back neighbourhood policing, with work to restore trust, which will work to restore the trust and presence that was dismantled. Communities like mine are desperate for officers who will build relationships, prevent crime before it happens, and reassure those who have lost faith. But it is true that we cannot solely arrest our way out of this crisis. We must invest in our young people, not only to steer them away from crime, but to offer them a future beyond that. Like many others, I have binge-watched the compelling drama Adolescence, which highlighted so well the toxic online culture that our young people are exposed to.
Well, I'm in good way. Sorry,
That's right.
Does she agree with me that when we think about violence against women and girls and the role of role models for young men, that we do need to have a bit of a greater focus about protecting the future of our young men and thinking about how we can help them deal with the challenges they face to make them safer and to give them their space within our communities?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I completely agree with her that there is absolutely the need to ensure that we are supporting our young men, and the starting that journey is to tackle some of the toxic and quite concerning material that we find online, and also ensuring that the social media companies with their billions are doing the right thing to manage that content, which I don't believe they are at this point in time. So it is a culture that we have to tackle head on, and it's one that seeks to legitimise and glorify misogyny, gang violence and exploit vulnerability. We must prevent our young people being dragged into that cycle of harm before they even realise what is happening. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is our opportunity and our responsibility to break the cycle, working across party, rebuilding what has been lost and giving the assurances to our communities that never again should a generation grow up believing that carrying a knife is their only protection, their only option and their future.
I call Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Huntingdon for securing this really important debate and his powerful speech. The devastating impact of knife crime is felt at the heart of my constituency of Vauxhall and Camberwell Green. And the most heartbreaking thing that you do as an MP is speak to a parent who's just heard that their precious son or daughter has been taken away far too young by knife crime. No parent should have to bury their child. When you're sat there as an MP trying to comfort a family through something so horrific, you sit there in their front room and you glance over their shoulder and you see the pictures of that smiling face, that young life innocently robbed. This is something I should and never have to get used to, but this is something that we are all having to do as members of Parliament. My honourable friend from Clapham and Brixton Hill highlighted some of the statistics. But we must remember when we talk about those statistics, as awful as they are in their own right, every single one of those figures, someone loved them. A friend, a family, an aunt, an uncle, a brother, a grandparent, a mother and sister, who are now devastated by losing someone who had barely started their life. And I want to touch on a wider impact of knife crime on communities, and an area which sometimes I think we don't give enough focus. When I was on the London Assembly, I authored a report titled Gang Associated Girls. And in this report, we looked at the impact of knife crime and other crime on girls and young women. And if we're honest, they may not be viewed as the immediate victims of knife crime, but the long-term trauma and experience that they go through, because when a number of these incidents happen, it's these same very young women and girls who are at the first at the scene. It's these same women and girls who are helping the community grieve. It's these same young women and girls who are organising the funerals. And when the glare of the media has gone, and it's now out of the news cycle, it's these same women and girls going back to lay flowers at the cemetery and remembering those key anniversaries. And we need to remember that just because those young women and girls are not presenting at hospital with the knife crime, it's about their long-term trauma. And it's important for us not to forget their voices in this debate on knife crime. And that's why I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need the holistic approach and when we look at this and addressing this, because the whole community needs to come together if we're to break this vicious cycle of knife crime that we are seeing and break the chain of trauma that is impacting so many of our young people, robbing them of that future. It saddens me that just a few weeks ago there was a tragic shooting in my constituency, and in the line of sight from a playground up to primary school was the blue line saying police do not cross. The impact on those children. So it's vital that we continue to work cross-party to address this. This isn't about politics. This is about young people dying on our streets up and down the country. So I'm pleased to see the government committing to the Young Futures Foundation programme, which will help champion those vital youth workers who, for many of these young people, are the lifeline that they need. But if we're honest, those youth workers haven't been paid properly, and many of them have lost their jobs, seeing their youth centres close. So we need to continue speaking about this, and I know that the government will continue to work with us to make sure that we address the vicious cycle that is robbing so many of our young people of their lives.
I call Richard Baker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also congratulate the member for Huntingdon and all those who've worked to secure this important debate on knife crime, which has been a deeply vexing issue in our society for decades, and today we are once again at a point where further action is needed to save lives, as we've heard from so many powerful contributions from honourable members across the chamber this afternoon. And I was pleased to see in the excellent briefing for this debate by the Safer Knives Group that Professor John Crichton of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland has brought his expertise to the work of the group. His study in knife crime reduction in Scotland showed that the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit strategy of targeting young men carrying knives in public led to a 69% reduction in offensive weapon charges and a 50% drop in sharp instrument homicides between 2005 and 2016. These approaches show that restricting immediate access to knives reduces offences and saves lives, but crucially, as other members have pointed out, they must be complemented by preventative approaches to knife crime focused on the possession of knives among young people and focused on awareness as well. At the time that important work was initiated, there was huge concern in Scotland around the levels of knife crime. In 2010-11, the police in Scotland caught someone with a knife every 90 minutes. In 2009, the Scottish Parliament held a knife crime summit following a petition brought to the Parliament by John Muir of Greenock, whose son Damien was murdered with a knife in 2007. And it was a privilege for me to work alongside John in his campaign in my role as Shadow Justice Secretary in Holyrood at the time. And while John's campaign did call for tougher penalties for knife crime in sentencing, it also focused on the need to raise awareness of the trauma which so often follows someone's decision to carry a knife, for which there are often many complex reasons, as we've heard today. But John went into schools to take his powerful personal message to young people, and that really had an impact at that time. But today in Scotland, sadly, the indications are that we have a worrying trend on knife crime in the wrong direction. The crime statistics for Scotland show that in 23-24 there were nearly 11,000 offences of handling an offensive weapon, an 11% increase from the previous year, and there's been an increase in homicides as well. In Methil, in my constituency, the community has been particularly disturbed by social media posts of violent attacks in the community. In one post, a young person brandished a knife, who was then later attacked with a knife themselves, was slashed in the face. The fear is that if further action isn't taken to address these incidents, more young people will be seriously injured and could lose their lives. Scottish ministers must ensure local police have the resources they need to deal with these incidents. There's other interventions in the community which are required to support these young people. We must have the right legislation in place to restrict sales of knives. I very much welcome the measures which have been brought forward by ministers, particularly in the aftermath of the horrific attacks in Southport, which you heard so powerfully about from the member for South Ribble earlier in this debate. We are once more at a point in communities right across the UK where further measures to protect our young people from knife crime are urgently needed. The impassioned calls for action from those whose lives have been devastated by these crimes have been given voice by members across this chamber, and so powerfully as well from the member for Birmingham in terms of her personal experience too. This must move us all, and I'm confident these voices have been heard and that this Parliament will act and will do more to protect our young people from knife crime.
I call Alice Macdonald.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Norfolk as a rule is a safe county with a generally lower than average rates of crime. It's a wonderful place to live, and for many children who grew up there as I did, they have a fantastic childhood. But this is sadly not the case for every young person. We face an increasing challenge with the intertwining of knife crime and county lines activity in our area, which is having a devastating effect. And it's on this element that I want to focus my remarks. Since being a Member of Parliament, I have met Emma and Phil Dix, whose 18-year-old son, Joe, was tragically stabbed to death in my constituency in 2022. 3 young men were found guilty of his murder. Joe's parents have spoken about how they feel Joe was exploited by County Line's drug dealers and became trapped in a vicious cycle. I want to quote what Emma, his mum, has said. She said, "I don't think we've really tackled the root causes of why people are carrying and using knives, particularly in Norfolk. Unfortunately, we've buried it under the sand for quite a while. Some of it is going to be related to mental health, exploitation and grooming as well. We know that with a lot of incidents caused through county lines, people won't go to the police due to their fear of repercussions. As the Minister knows, the phrase county lines refers to the mobile phone lines used to take order of drugs, and it has been strongly linked to violent offences, including knife crime. I recently met with the Minister to discuss this issue, and I welcome her engagement on it, and it's also a real focus of work for police in Norfolk. Since its creation 5 years ago, Norfolk's County Line team has reportedly investigated more than 200 phone lines with 213 charges and more than 570 years in prison sentences. I welcome that because it is vital that those running these lines, who so often cruelly exploit young people, are brought to justice. Emma and Phil have since set up the Joe Dix Foundation, and they've welcomed the government's plans for recognising child criminal exploitation as a standalone offence in the Crime and Policing Bill. They've also called for a national register for all perpetrators who are convicted of child criminal exploitation, and I wondered if the Minister could reply directly to that in her response. Their story, like the stories of so many families across our country, just underlines why this government's commitment to tackle knife crime is so important, and why I welcome this debate today and want to thank the member for Huntingdon for securing it. But to tackle county lines and knife crimes amongst young people, we must, as we have heard today, focus on prevention, intervention, education and tackling the root causes. I welcome the recently launched Coalition to Tackle Knife Crime, and indeed Emma and Phil are members of that group. It is a welcome collaboration because it is only through listening to the voices of those on the ground that we will find solutions to these issues. I recently held a youth engagement forum with community groups and young people across Norwich North. And the overall message, as we have heard today, was the importance of multiple organisations collaborating on early intervention measures to prevent young people from going down dangerous paths and to give them opportunities. I agree very strongly with the message about a public health approach, and as a councillor in London, in my honourable friend's part of my honourable friend's constituency of Vauxhall and Camberwell, I saw that firsthand, and many of the community groups there. In my constituency, organisations like the Joe Dix Foundation, MAP, Norfolk YMCA, Sprouton Youth Engagement Project, Future Projects and the district councils all do fantastic work, and I want to pay tribute to them. But most importantly, we must listen to young people, and young people at that round table raised a range of issues we have covered today, including the need for more youth-friendly spaces, the lack of opportunities for work experience and employment, and the need to tackle some of the online harms we have discussed today. So I particularly want to welcome the new Young Futures programme and the hubs which will be set up. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is only by taking a holistic approach to combating knife crime that we will really begin to pull it out at its roots. And I'm clear that collaboration with young people and those on the front lines is key. The Youth Endowment Fund has highlighted many of the most effective solutions when it comes to reducing violent crime. So we have the evidence, with this government we have the political will, we have consensus across both sides of this House that we must work together to tackle knife crime, because none of us can sit back while precious lives are being lost and young people's lives are being destroyed.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I also thank the gallant member for securing this vital and very important debate. Knife crime amongst children and young people is one of the most devastating incidents to occur in our constituencies. Last summer in Southend and Rochford, there were multiple incidents of machetes and beaches, machete attacks on our beaches and our high streets. It was incredibly troubling, and I have set about meeting with families and businesses affected. I'm also currently in the process of commissioning the Youth Summit to see what we can do, find out all the gaps in the community, the things that we don't know through the eyes and voices of our young people. Madam Deputy Speaker, honourable members here may know, and they may not, Essex is within the top 10 counties for reported knife crime. As parents, friends, family members of young people, I'm sure we all understand the sheer horror you feel when you hear incidents involving knives. Every single offence is one too many. In fact, as a young man, well, actually as a boy, I was attacked a number of times by a knife. And I was very lucky to survive. And it broke my mum's heart, actually, knowing that she couldn't protect me every time I left the house. And so it's one of the reasons why I've not really shared the story too wide publicly. It's one of the reasons why I spent the last 20 years sort of mentoring and supporting young people, because I can see how hard it is sort of traversing neighbourhoods often, as the Honourable Member for Birmingham and Erdington mentioned. Sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Knife crime ruins lives, as I've mentioned. Knowing people and childhood friends who have also lost their lives through knife crime and drug crime, it's particularly sort of tough sort of having this debate today. And actually having sat around and been sat in the living room, as the Honourable colleague just mentioned, talking to families that have lost a young person, is a scenario, and it's a setting that no one ever really wants to go through. And it's the pain that you see and you feel emanating from the parents and the family because of the loss of that young person is something that you just can't describe. Madam Deputy Speaker, I wholeheartedly welcome our Labour government's commitment to halve violent knife crime in a decade, and we have not wasted any time to deliver on this commitment. Rona's law introduces stricter online safe regulations to prevent weapons from falling into the hands of young people. This includes new offences if possessing a knife or an offensive weapon with intent, increasing the maximum penalty for manufacturing, selling, hiring, or indeed lending prohibited weapons, and creates new offences of child criminal exploitation and cuckooing, often associated with county lines. It is also essential to not only that we ban the selling of machetes and sharp weapons, but make kitchen knives safer and have a strategy of prevention. Young people in South and East of Rochford, much like other coastal communities, face a unique set of challenges. The conversation today isn't just about sort of urban communities. It's also about sort of, or even immigration. It's about validation, self-esteem, boredom, role models, or the absence of them. And they're huge contributing factors in how and what we see playing out with the violence that our young people are enacting on each other. We have a high unemployment, high levels of health inequality, and often feel the brunt of the lack of transport and connectivity. The changes that the government proposes cannot come quickly enough. Thank you.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to speak on behalf of my constituents across Luton South and South Bedfordshire who have sadly come together to stand against knife crime on too many occasions in recent years. There were consistent failures by the previous Conservative government to toughen up legislation around dangerous weapons, as well as a failure to ensure proper funding for our police forces. And as we've heard from many members across the House, and I totally agree, sustained cutbacks on youth services, all combined to allow a knife crime epidemic to take hold in our towns and cities. Knife crime destroys lives, devastates families and leaves lasting trauma on communities, and behind every single one of these statistics is a person whose life remains ever changed or sadly needlessly lost. And sadly in Luton we are all too familiar with the devastation knife crime causes. But if I may reflect on one, the shocking murder of Azan Khalil, AJ, in 2018 when he was just 18, because from darkness must come light. And as AJ's mum, Roseanne Taylor, she is that light, and I was honoured to be able to present her with a Knife Angel Community Award to recognise her dedication and selflessness in using her own story as a mother who lost her son to raise awareness of the impact of knife crime and her ongoing work with young people in knife crime prevention. That award was named after the Knife Angel sculpture, an amazing statue of over 8 metres tall, created from 100,000 surrendered knives, which was based in Luton Town Centre last summer as part of its ongoing tour. It's a powerful symbol and catalyst for discussions about knife crime and violence, with the aim to educate and raise awareness, particularly with young people. And as the Knife Angel left our town, we marked the event with a vigil at St Mary's Church, a candlelit walk of remembrance and a closing ceremony in St George's Square. We remembered all those lost to knife crime and committed to eliminating this violence by inspiring positive choices. And lots of brilliant organisations are working to make this happen, while also dealing with the reality of sadly what continues to take place. Bedfordshire Veru Just Drop It campaign is working with local partners to encourage our young people to take a brighter path by going knife-free. Wingman mentors who've worked with Bedfordshire Veru are installing life-saving bleed kits across our company as a step to try to avoid loss of life after a stabbing. And in a similar vein, the Luton, Dunstable and surrounding area Kenyan Community Forum youth group created a safeguard with help from the group's youth coordinator, Wangi Maturi, which shares vital information about what to do when helping the victim of a stabbing, sadly created following the death of a young friend. Unlike the Conservatives, our Labour government has been ambitious in our mission to get knives off our streets and ensure people across our towns and communities are safe from violent crime, with our commitment to halve knife crime across a decade. Our Labour government has already banned ownership of zombie-style knives and machetes, and measures in our flagship crime and policing bill will go further to crack down on knife crime. And like others, I welcome the emphasis on prevention through our Young Futures programme and other initiatives. Tackling knife crime is also an important part of Labour's Bedfordshire Police and Crime Commissioner John Tizard's Police and Crime Plan through its joint work with Bedfordshire Veru. So I'd welcome the Minister informing the House whether any additional funding will be announced for Bedfordshire Veru to ensure it can continue its excellent work to keep our local community safe. Taken together, these measures will directly improve support for children and young people who are sadly often most at risk when it comes to being perpetrators but also victims of knife crime.
I call Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I thank the member for Huntingdon for securing this important debate. Knife crime amongst children and young people is a national emergency that should shame us all. And with 3,000 knife crime offences reported in the year ending March 2024 involving children, this crisis cannot be ignored. Because each one of those numbers represents a young person caught in violence, someone's son, someone's daughter, someone who deserved better. And in Croydon, where we have some of the highest rates of knife violence in London, and where too many young people have lost their lives, we know the impact of knife crime only too well. In Croydon, Eliane Andam, a 15-year-old who is described by those who loved her as vibrant, bright and loving, was taken from her family on her way to school in an act of violence that is beyond comprehension. Too many young lives have been taken too soon. Too many communities living in fear of the next tragedy, and too many families are being left in unimaginable grief. So I welcome this government's commitment to halving knife crime over the next 10 years and the urgency it is taking action, such as going after the criminal gangs who are grooming our children into crime and people trafficking them across the country, introducing Ronan's Law to crack down on online sales of knives, and finally to bring the ban on zombie knives into action. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not enough to be tough on knife crime. We must be just as tough on its complex causes. So I welcome this government's plan to roll out its Young Futures programme. But as is often said, Madam Deputy Speaker, it takes a village to raise a child. And with Universal Youth Services seeing a 73% cut in funding since 2010, and young people often stuck on CAM's waiting lists for years, where is that village today? What can they point to that demonstrates that this country is willing to invest in them, to back them, to support them? So I urge this government to move faster in prioritising the well-being of our children, because as it is also said, if a child is not embraced by the village, it will burn it down to feel its warmth. In Croydon and in partnership with the Mayor of London, organisations are working tirelessly to provide support to young people and to rebuild that village around them. Whether it's Red Fred working in Croydon University Hospital, the groundbreaking My Ends project, Reaching Higher, which is supporting young people in school, community and at home, Croydon Drop-In, which offers free mental health support, or Croydon Youth Consortium, which is driving collaboration between local youth charities. Croydon is leading the way and giving young people a stake in their community. However, due to impending budget cuts, Croydon, which is London's youngest borough, is on the verge of losing its youth engagement team. This team provides a critical link between the council, the voluntary sector and the vulnerable young people across the borough.
They provide outreach, run youth hubs in hard-to-reach areas. To put simply, Madam Deputy Speaker, Croydon's youth engagement team saves lives. So as it builds its Young Futures programme and looks to create a national youth strategy, I urge the government to ensure that it works with and not against grassroots organisations that know their communities best, that it provides long-term funding for youth-centred provision in local areas, and that it looks at increasing the statutory protections for local youth services so they are given the priority that they deserve. Madam Deputy Speaker, knife crime amongst children and young people is devastating but not inevitable. Now is the time to invest in prevention as well as enforcement. Now is the time to listen to those working on the front lines of this crisis. And now is the time to give our young people the support they need, because our communities, our families and our young people deserve better. Thank you.
Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a very timely debate as members considered the knife crime provisions of the Crime and Policing Bill only last week, and so I congratulate the Backbench Committee on granting time and thank the honourable member moving the debate for his very compelling speech. Indeed, we've heard some very emotional speeches today, and they show the empathy, I think, between members on all sides here and the victims of knife crime and their families. Over the years, I've met with constituents who've had their lives irrevocably changed by knife crime, whether that be due to the murder of a loved one or through serious injury. I've spoken with mothers who've lost their children, but also with the adult children who've lost their elderly parents after they were stabbed to death. Knife crime can affect anyone, and the pain that the surviving family members live with after such horrific events is palpable. The Minister will know, as I've spoken in this House and with her on several occasions, I want to talk about harm reduction. Of the crimes of the knife of death caused by knives, where knives is an identifiable weapon, where we know what the weapon is, 2/3 of those identified knives used to kill people are kitchen knives. This shouldn't be surprising. Many murders are unplanned, committed on the spur of the moment with little thought, and kitchen knives are the weapons most readily to hand. There's been much in the media this week about the new Netflix drama Adolescence. The series is a commentary on the many problems, not just knife crime, young people face growing up, but it does highlight how an easily accessible weapon can be used to cause devastation and change the course of many people's lives forever. For years, bereaved families, support groups, youth groups and schools have been calling for the government today to do something tangible to stop this from happening and to allow children to have a childhood. Their calls are now joined by prominent voices like Idris Elba and Stephen Graham, the latter describing a pandemic of knife crime in our country. I know this government is listening and wants to make change, but we need to do it quickly and do it thoroughly.
Yes.
Previous government's measures didn't go far enough. The new measures in the Crime and Policing Bill go further, but still more can be done. There's now a growing campaign to phase out kitchen knives with pointed tips as an everyday household item and replace them with kitchen knives with rounded tips, as the move of the debate mentioned earlier. It's well documented that pointed knives are more likely to pierce vital organs and sever arteries. These injuries are far more likely to be fatal. Rounded knives are much less likely to cause lethal injuries. And most of us rarely use the pointed end of a kitchen knife when cooking. There are some measures within the Crime and Policing Bill that limit the purchase of new knives, but there are already millions of pointed kitchen knives in drawers around the country. The Safer Knives Group, which I'm a member, has suggested a pilot scheme to convert pointed kitchen knives into safer rounded tip knives. Yeah. We need to encourage manufacturers to replace pointed knives with rounded knives as an alternative and discourage the sale of pointed knives by creating a price differential. As I've said, making knives safer is only one step in reducing the number of deaths and serious injuries. Education, intervention and support following the methods of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit would produce long-term solutions. And it's also vital we collect more data on the types of knives used in any knife-related crime. So information, policy changes, legislation and indeed expert advice are all important. But what this all has to lead to is a change of behaviour so that we stop, the community stops killing each other with knives. And this has to be a national priority, and I know the Minister agrees with me on that, but we have to see action, and it's all of us who have to work on that.
Democrat spokesperson Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The epidemic of knife crime has been an issue I've addressed many times in this place, though never in a debate specifically targeting its impact on children and young people. I commend the gallant member for Huntingdon for securing this debate on such a significant matter. In Britain, we face a hard truth. Young people are increasingly involved in violent crime, and this cycle is becoming ever more entrenched. Figures from the Ben Kinsella Trust show that across the country, 614 young people under 24 have been killed by knife crime in the last 10 years, with 17 of those being 16 or younger. Children are being exposed to the tragic normalisation of stabbings. We have sleepwalked into a scenario whereby many young people feel it's safer and easier to carry a knife to defend themselves. Threats of punishment are in this context unsurprisingly failing to deter violent behaviour. Knife crime should be treated as the societal disease it is, and we cannot afford to just treat the symptoms anymore. If this government is to truly tackle knife crime, it must address its roots, the deep-seated factors that drive young people to such violence in the first place. Madam Deputy Speaker, to tackle knife crime, we must stop it before it starts. We must use a public health approach that addresses the root causes: fear, trauma, lack of opportunities and social exclusion. This approach has many tenets, some of which I shall outline today. It begins with education. When young people carry knives, it is often out of fear, not necessarily out of a desire to harm others. A study by the Ben Kinsella Trust revealed that over 1 in 3 young people don't feel safe in their own communities. 36% don't feel safe walking the streets, and 2/3 report anxiety over knife crime in their areas. The teenage brain is wired differently from adults. We know that a tendency towards impulsive and risky behaviour is much more common during adolescence. Studies show that in many cases, knife crime occurs in the heat of the moment, where an altercation could have been resolved without serious injury if a weapon had not been present. This is exactly why we must address the issue before it happens, before the knife is ever pulled from a pocket and escalates beyond control. Education can play a principal part in challenging the misconceptions that carrying a knife somehow makes you safer. It's about teaching young people the real consequences of carrying this weapon, how it destroys lives, impacts families, and perpetrates the fear amongst their peers and communities. Absolutely.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech about an issue that I think we all would agree with across this House. I've spoken a number of times with Harlow Police Department about the issue of knives and knife crime, not just in Harlow but across Essex, and they do a lot of work with schools, and I think, would he agree with me that it's important that schools fully engage with the police in these issues and don't see it as a stigma to their school, and actually that they need to all engage with that process?
I completely agree. I'll come on to a section a bit later on, but I spoke to the organisers and leaders of the Chris Donovan Trust in my constituency, who spoke particularly about the challenges getting into some schools to talk about knife crime, because the perception that they were going to talk about it was a problem in itself, and it was so frustrating to hear. We need to have honest, open conversations with young people in schools. Teachers must be equipped with materials to educate the next generation to break this cycle of violence. Even if a child is not at risk of committing a knife-related offence, educational programmes serve a critical role. They can teach children about the consequences of knife crime long before they may consider carrying a weapon. And that's vital. We need to reach young people and win the war for their hearts and minds before the prevailing climate of fear and the harbingers of toxic mindsets can start their offensive. I urge the government to consider introducing mandatory PSHE lessons on the consequences of weapons possession and put the principles of restorative practice on the curriculum, in recognition of the great work of groups like the Chris Donovan Trust in my constituency. We teach children about the dangers of diseases caused by smoking or alcohol from an early age. Why then are we not having open discussions with them about the health risks associated with carrying a knife? By creating safe spaces for discussion and building relationships with young people, intervention can occur before thoughts of crimes arise, and deaths can be prevented. But to fully realise the nourishing, community-focused element of a public health approach, we must also invest in youth services and community programmes that engage young people. Winning that war for hearts and minds means providing them with opportunities to build skills, pursue education and find alternatives to gang culture and criminal activity. And yet we've seen a dramatic decline in youth services funding in recent years, as has been mentioned in many speeches. Cuts totalling £1.1 billion since 2010, and this has left too many young people without the support they need. Investing in youth service is not just about providing a safe space, it's about providing young people with alternatives to violence that can break the cycles of crime. It's about shifting the culture of violence and empowering communities to work together to prevent crime before it escalates. The Targeted Early Help and Integrated Support team at Sutton Borough Council in my constituency do exactly this kind of work, offering opportunities to young people who are not often afforded the luxury of such attention elsewhere in their lives. And yet these programmes rely heavily on grants from MOPAC, the Ministry of Justice and Violence Reduction Services, grants that are subject constantly to uncertainty, often approved at the last minute, and often only allocated for 18-month to 2-year periods, preventing proper forward planning. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must do better than that. We need to consistently get serious funding to these initiatives in a timely manner, and I echo the calls from the member for Dulwich and West Norwood for funding for these community schemes. On these benches, we'll continue to push the government to make youth diversion a statutory duty, so that every part of the country has a pre-charged diversion scheme for young people up to the age of 25. That will ensure better outcomes for young people and less strain on police resources. But let's be honest with ourselves. Those police resources are already strained beyond breaking point in too many places, and education and early intervention alone isn't enough to properly implement the public health approach. Visible community policing starts with actual police numbers in our London boroughs. And to tackle knife crime, it's important for young people to see actual bobbies on the beat in London. Their active and engaged presence creates a sense of safety and security. We have to get back to a meaningful community policing, returning the police to their proper duty as a positive, engaging arm of the state in people's lives. Building trust between young people and the police is also crucial. This trust communicates there is no need to carry knives for protection, as young people know the police are there to keep them safe. As I've said before, when 17-year-old Ilyas Habibi was stabbed to death outside Sutton Station in my constituency in December 2023, he was just minutes away from a police station. And if we cannot expect visible policing in town centres and the areas closest to police stations themselves, then I ask this House, how little have we come to expect of community policing? To be clear, this is not a criticism of the police. It is a criticism of successive governments and mayors who have consistently failed to get police the resources they need to do their job. In London, far too many are abstracted away from the communities they are supposed to serve to help plug gaps. I was deeply concerned to learn of Sadiq Khan's budgeting decisions, which have led to dedicated police officers in schools in London to be removed. Under the new Met for London plan, officers will no longer be stationed in schools as part of the Safer Schools Officers Programme. While the plan claims that officers will still work closely with schools, this reduces the consistent, direct contact between officers and young people. This contact is crucial in building relationships with young people to foster trust. There should be plenty of positive interactions and experiences with the police throughout young people's formative years. This can be achieved through school assemblies or through classroom workshops. Young people need to understand that police are there to keep them safe on the streets and are not the enemy. But when sparse police resources are focused only on the most extreme forms of deterrence, such as live facial recognition and stop and search, and no community focus, it is unsurprising that they do not. The hallmark of a public health approach, a meaningful one that has the investment not just of money but of serious political capital, is that it brings together all groups in our communities. It creates a coalition of care, it breaks down the silo walls between projects, and it builds a team across society, a team committed to doing what it takes to rescue young people. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, on behalf of countless experts, professionals and parents, on behalf of those young people themselves, I implore the government to build that team, create that coalition of care, and finally implement a meaningful public health approach to knife crime. Thank you.
I'll Shadow Minister Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First and foremost, I would like to pay my respects to all those and the families of those mentioned today who have lost their lives due to knife crime. Too many families and communities have been and are being torn apart by knife crime, and I welcome the constructive, compassionate and collaborative approach that members across the House have taken in today's debate. This matter is far too important and the impacts far too devastating for anything but a shared focus on addressing and reducing this most violent of crimes. We cannot allow ourselves to be back here in a few years' time with more names, more stories, but no meaningful progress. No family, friend or school should have to lose a loved one to knife crime. Yet far, far too often, that is the precise reality being faced. As others have done, I wish to put on record my gratitude and admiration to our courageous police officers across the country who work tirelessly and fearlessly to help keep us and our communities safe. And I'd like to thank my honourable and gallant friend, the member for Huntingdon, for securing this vitally important debate, and in particular its emphasis on knife crime amongst young people. While we all recognise the prevalence and impacts of knife crime as a whole, the nuances that affect young people are integral, and developing an understanding of this problem, both as it stands today and as it will develop in the future, is important. And as he and other honourable members have raised, the world that young people today occupy is multi-layered, a hybrid of online and offline, where boundaries merge, coercion persists, and the reality of consequences of actions are too often overlooked until it is too late. Young people are being exposed to things at a much younger age than ever before, and the impacts of normalising and desensitising crime and violence is still not fully understood. While the number of hospital admissions for knife crime has declined from its peak, the figures remain far too high. We know the impact knife crime has on young people, so we must work to get knives out of perpetrators' hands. Thanks to research by the Youth Endowment Fund, we have a relatively clear picture of knife crime rates amongst young people. A small, but by no means insignificant number of young people carry offensive weapons. In the last 2 years, 5% of 13 to 17-year-old surveys admitted to carrying an offensive weapon, 47% of which were a knife. This illustrates that while only a minority of those involved in serious offences are knife carriers, their impact on their communities is significant. And of course, this is a nationwide figure. Rates will be significantly higher in parts of the country, many of which we've heard today, where knife crime is especially prevalent. Over the past decade, a number of steps have been taken to reduce knife crime. While violence against a person has decreased significantly since 2010, knife crime remains stubbornly and far too high. This suggests a specific targeted action is required to reduce knife crime offences, particularly amongst young people. Much needed measures were put forward and passed during the last government and implemented by the current one to close loopholes and introduce restrictions on zombie knives. Additionally, I welcome in the Crime and Policing Bill that replicates some of the Criminal Justice Bill and places more stringent rules on knife possession and expands police powers. 3 key measures outlined in the bill being the creation of an offence of possessing a bladed item with intent to harm, the increase in the maximum penalty of selling weapons to under 18s, and the power to seize, retain and destroy bladed articles have all rightly been included. Increasing the penalty for those selling knives to under 18s is clearly a step forward in enforcing stricter laws and protecting young people. Ensuring there are penalties for a range of weapons being used by young people is vital, as the police have highlighted individuals using social networks to specifically advertise a range of weapons to under 18s. Regarding the online sale of knives, Stephen Clayman's review provided a detailed assessment. And since, as I understand it, the measures in this assessment will largely be introduced as amendments to the bill, it'd be useful to hear from the Minister what impact she believes they will have on knife sales. And does she expect a significant reduction in the accessibility for those who currently acquire weapons through online means? However, while considering online sales, we must not be naive. Data shows that the significant number of weapons held by young people are kitchen knives, and as also noted by the member for Huntingdon, which, by their definition, are widely accessible. As members across the House have highlighted today, engagement, prevention and police interventions are crucial tools, not only in preventing individuals from committing crimes, but also in protecting young people who, far too often, are victims of offences committed by their peers. Stop and search saves lives and must play a role in addressing and preventing incidences of knife crime, allowing the disruption of crime and removing weapons from the street. Police must have the necessary powers to prevent crime because far too many lives are being violently cut short. Research published by the Oxford Journal of Policing found a potential of an over 50% reduction in attempted murders through stop and search. Knowing that police can stop and search is a powerful deterrent. Also important, of course, yes.
I thank the Shadow Minister for the comments and points that she's referencing. And yes, the police have a vital role to play in this. Does she agree that our youth workers working up and down the country with some of the most vulnerable young people are also a key defence in stopping some of these young people? Because the young people who are caught up in a vicious cycle of crime trust those youth workers in some instances more than they trust the police.
Yeah. I thank the Honourable Member for her comments, and I know that she is so engaged and invested in this issue. Youth workers, teachers, anyone, guardians, anyone who a child trusts is important in addressing this issue. We must ensure that everybody has the powers, the society have the powers we need to address knife crime, because any action that helps reduce knife crime is an action we should be looking at. As well as stop and search, it's also important that we get a drive to get weapons off the street through emerging technologies. For example, devices that allow detection of knives at a distance and in crowded streets, allowing officers to more precisely identify and remove knives from would-be perpetrators. Alongside enforcement, prevention and early interventions require attention, something the Conservatives did make advances in while in government. Between 2019 and 2024, violence reduction units were funded in areas of England and Wales where there was a prevalence of violent crime. And according to Home Office evidence, these have led to a significant reduction in hospital admissions for violent injuries. Since funding began, an estimated 3,220 hospital admissions for violent injuries have been prevented in these funded areas. Also, we must ensure that police have the ability to be in the right place at the right time. We've heard from members across the House today that too often it's being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which leads to injury through knife crime. This is particularly crucial for young people who congregate in hotspot areas, so ensuring our police forces have the resources to increase patrols and presence in such areas plays a key role in both the prevention and response. I acknowledge that the Government has placed significant emphasis on the delivery of young future hubs to identify young people most at risk of being drawn into crime. While we all recognise the benefits of providing support to young people, the effectiveness of these hubs will depend on their implementation. Resources must be distributed effectively to ensure young people receive the support they need, particularly given the range of activities the Government intends these hubs to carry out alongside the reduction of knife crime. Therefore, I would ask the Minister how these hubs will be structured and what work will take place outside their physical spaces to ensure effective engagement and early intervention. We have also seen police and crime commissioners using their independence to explore programmes which can intervene earlier. For instance, the Thames Valley PCC Matthew Barber's Operation Deter Youth ensures that youth offending services make contact to under-18s arrested for weapon or violent offences within 90 minutes of notification of arrest, followed by a house visit between 48 hours. While I'm not asking the Minister to be prescriptive, will she ensure that police forces have the Government's backing to trial innovative techniques such as knife scanning and new preventative techniques to help save young lives? And fundamentally, what are her plans to change the mindset that has developed that has enabled children to stab and murder other children? Madam Deputy Speaker, reducing knife crime among young people is a critical task for this and any government. When we hear the names that we've heard today of some of the many, too many, young lives that have been lost to knife crime, we are reminded that these are not just statistics but devastating events that bring untold anguish to families. We must do everything possible to bring down the numbers.
Mr. Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and let me start by thanking the honourable and gallant gentleman for Huntingdon for securing this debate on an issue that matters enormously to us all. And his opening speech was, as ever, as is his way, eloquent, thought-provoking and challenging, and it ranged widely, including the role of social media, and he referred specifically to drill rappers' music, influencing children and young people. And I did just want to refer him to the important work of Project Alpha, based in the Met, and also the role that the Online Safety Act will now have as the provisions come into force, and the role of Ofcom. And there have been many insightful and heartfelt speeches this afternoon, and I am grateful to every member who has spoken. In particular, I think my honourable friend for South Ribble, who spoke on behalf of the victims' families. Particularly, I'm sure the whole House would like to thank the parents of Child A from that horrific Southport attack and what they had to say. And then my honourable friends for Dulwich and West Norwood, Clapham and Brixton, Vauxhall and Camberwell Green all spoke with such knowledge and have done a huge amount in their local areas to tackle knife crime. And of course my honourable friend for Birmingham, Erdington, who spoke in a very personal way about the attack on her nephew and how that had affected him and her family. And again, I hope the whole House will want to wish her nephew well in recovering from that attack. And my honourable friend for Glenrothes and Mid-Fife, who gave us the Scottish perspective, always really useful to hear what's happening in other parts of the United Kingdom. And my honourable friend for Southend East and Rochford, who spoke very personally about being the victim of knife crime. And I just also want to refer to my honourable friend for Hammersmith and Chiswick, who has been talking at length to me about this whole issue of harm reduction and the issue of rounded kitchen knives. And I do want to reassure him that nothing is off the table when it comes to tackling the scourge of knife crime and saving young lives, and the Home Office is considering a proposal brought to us on rounded kitchen knives. Now, before I go on to deal with many of the issues that were raised this afternoon, I do just want to make a sort of opening comment, which is what I detected as being the prevailing message of the debate this afternoon. Because I think no matter what side of the House that we sit on, whatever party we belong to and whatever constituency we represent, we can all agree that knife crime causes enormous harm in our communities. It's destructive and all too often deadly. And too often, those affected are teenagers and young people with the rest of their lives ahead of them. We all know that when someone carries a knife or a dangerous weapon, the potential for bloodshed is always only ever seconds away. And each fatal stabbing triggers a trail of devastation. First and foremost, of course, there is the victim deprived of his or her future. Then there is the victim's family, left to come to terms with the most unimaginable loss. And there is also an impact on the wider community when these incidents occur. So while we discuss policies and legislation and initiatives, we must always keep the individuals and the families affected at the forefront of our minds. And on that note, I want to take the opportunity to say that my thoughts and prayers are with all of those who have suffered as a result of knife crime. And I also want to thank all of the police and our emergency service workers who have to deal with knife crime in our communities. Now, turning to the approach that this government is taking, I will very briefly, yes.
I appreciate my honourable friend's giving way, and will she join with me in recognising the great work done by PCSOs Nikki, Demi, Gavin and others in my constituency of North Warwickshire and Bedworth to prevent knife crime, and the Rod Squad in Bedworth encouraging young people to put down knives and take up fishing rods and enjoy the peace of the water instead.
Very grateful for my honourable friend for telling the House all about that excellent work that's going on in her constituency, and particularly the role of the PCSOs. Now, I know that time is short this afternoon and there were lots of questions that were raised with me. So if I don't get the chance to answer all the questions, I will write to honourable members specifically. The House will know that under the Safer Streets mission led by the Home Secretary, Secretary, we are driving a whole-of-government approach to halving violence against women and girls, halving knife crime and restoring confidence in policing and the justice system. And as part of that, the Plan for Change sets out our key reforms to strengthen neighbourhood policing, tackle antisocial behaviour and improve confidence in law enforcement. Now, on offensive weapons, for any effective response to this issue, we must, of course, include action to get dangerous knives and weapons out of circulation and off our streets. And we have already demonstrated our commitment to putting in place stronger controls in the months since the general election. We've implemented the ban on zombie-style knives and zombie-style machetes on the 24th of September, and it's now illegal to sell or own these weapons. Furthermore, we also committed in our manifesto to ban ninja swords, and we have consulted on the legal description and are progressing our plans to bring forward an effective ban later this year. As to online sales, which a number of honourable members referred to, we are clear that stronger checks are needed to be in place to prevent under 18-year-olds from being able to purchase knives online, which is why last October the Home Secretary commissioned Commander Stephen Clayman as the National Police Chiefs Council lead for knife crime to carry out a comprehensive full review into the online sale and delivery of knives, and that review was published on the 19th of February. We are taking immediate action on a number of key recommendations in the report and have announced Ronan's Law, after Ronan Kanda, who was fatally stabbed in June 2023, and the dedicated campaigning by his mum, Pooja Kanda. So Ronan's Law will comprise of a range of measures which will include requiring online retailers to report any bulk or suspicious-looking purchase of knives to the police, and introduce a new offence of possessing an offensive weapon with intent for violence. The Home Secretary has also announced that the government intends to strengthen age verification controls and checks for all online sellers of knives at the point of purchase and on delivery. And as my honourable friend, the chair of the Housing, Local Government and Community Select Committee raised, we will be bringing forward amendments to the Crime and Policing Bill to enact our manifesto commitment to introduce personal liability measures for executives of online companies that fail to take action against illegal knife and offensive weapons content. I just want to refer to the Coalition to Tackling Knife Crime. This, of course, was set up by the Prime Minister in September 2024, which brings together campaign groups, families of those who've tragically lost their lives to knife crime, young people who've been impacted, and community leaders, united in their mission to save lives. And I think it's really important that we have the lived experience of young people for the coalition. We're working with our member organisations to ensure that they have a platform to hear those young voices, to share their views, ideas and solutions to making Britain a safer place for the next generation. The Young Futures and Prevention Partnerships has been referred to throughout the debate by many of my honourable friends, including my honourable friend for Luton South and South Bedfordshire, and my honourable friend for Huddersfield. What we know is that too many children and young people today are facing poorer life outcomes, including becoming involved in knife crime, because they have not been effectively identified and supported early on. This can be caused by limited life opportunities, or they are particularly vulnerable. And to address these issues, we have committed to the creation of the Young Futures programme, which will establish a network of Young Futures hubs and Young Futures prevention partnerships to intervene early on to ensure that this cohort is identified and offered support in a more systematic way. Young Futures hubs will bring together the support services that tackle the underlying needs of vulnerable children and young people, making them more accessible to those that need them. And these hubs will promote children and young people's development, improve their mental health and well-being, and prevent them from being drawn into crime. And as for the Young Futures Prevention Partnership, they will identify children and young people who are vulnerable to being drawn into crime and violence, including knife crime, antisocial behaviour and violence against women and girls, and divert them by offering them effective and evidence-based support in a more systematic way. I also just want to refer to county lines and child criminal exploitation very very briefly, as it was referred to by a number of honourable friends. It's the most, county lines is the most violent model of drug supply and a harmful form of child criminal exploitation. Through the county lines programme, we are and will continue to target exploitative drug dealing gangs and break the organised criminal groups behind the trade, and we know that knives play a huge part in that. I can see, Madam Deputy Speaker, that you're wanting me to conclude. There's so much more to say on this, but in conclusion, I just again want to congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing this debate. We have to get a grip of what is, as we said in our manifesto, a national crisis. The public want change, and we are determined to deliver it.
Very quickly wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The issue of knife crime amongst children and young people has for too long been a stain on this country, on our communities, a blight on our collective social conscience, and the increasing involvement of children, both as perpetrators and victims, is an issue that cannot and should not be ignored. It is this at its heart that collectively we must change, that I would look to the government to grasp the nettle on. Whilst the public health approach they are likely to adopt has merit, there is need for a sustained, impassioned intervention to prevent our children from becoming murderers, to remove this fictional threat that they are buying into, to make children feel safe, even when they actually already are. I would like to thank all those members who took the time to contribute today in this important debate and for paying tribute to those who have lost their lives. I'm pleased that we've been able to put heat and light on some of the often overlooked aspects of the cause of this issue and the potential solutions too. There is much to do in addressing the root cause of this issue, a myriad of factors which we've tried to cover as broadly as we can, but I'm conscious that this is too broad a topic to solve in just one debate. I hope that we've collectively raised issues which give the government pause to consider in developing their own strategy to achieve their aim. I would dearly love none of us to ever need to raise knife crime in this House ever again.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. We now move swiftly on to the backbench debate on coastal communities. I'll just give a few moments for the front benches to swap over and members to settle.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.